My name is HeidiSiwak. I'm a middle school grade 6 teacher this year with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. I teach language, social studies, and technology. And you've seen a lot today about the tech, and I want to speak a little bit about the pedagogy today in creating better thinkers as we move students through this system. It's a complex world, so what? What does it mean for our learners? So I am lucky to inhabit a media-rich classroom. I have a 3D printer in my room. We do interesting projects. We still do hands-on things. And we use technology to create demonstrations of learning. I just want to give you a little picture of my class, because what it looks like when you're in a decentralized classroom. This is towards the end of the year, what learning actually looks like. Look at the sound. It's not picking it up. Oh well. So this was a project where my students actually tried to figure out if they could be in charge of their own learning. I wasn't allowed to do anything for 2 weeks, except that they had questions come to me, and this was her final presentations to groups. This student had composed music. Other students had learned how to bake. They really could learn anything that they wanted to. I'm just going to.
So what was the objective in you are not participating?
So we had gone through an entire year of inquiry trying to understand what it means to be a learner. And so in this particular project, they had watched a video of high school students in the United States who had designed their own course and were in self-directed learning. And we wondered if grade 7 students would be capable of doing that. So let's try it out. And our whole learning discussions that took place over the course of the 2 weeks was, what have you learned about learning? But it gives you an idea of what the environment is like in my classroom as we head towards the end of the year. And now I'm stuck.
So what they were learning was irrelevant. It was their metacognition.
It was the metacognition that was significant, yes. So, but I've also come to realize, since I first began this, that media literacy has become more complex, and there's things I need to think about that I didn't have to think about even 10 years ago. Things like the massive amounts of data being collected on students, confidential information sitting on my phone right now because somebody has sent me an email about a student and it's there, and that information is only secure as my password on my iPhone. Student agency in the posting of videos, pictures by teachers. Do they want them to be there for the long term? Students are creators now. What are their intellectual property rights within that? And a student's right to be forgotten, to have those teen years erased and their learning not be permanently online, and who actually owns student data. So I want to address a little bit the idea of what does data collection actually look like, because we've heard that a lot today in the presentations. So this is a tool that I use in my classroom. Kids love it, I love it, parents love it. It's a math learning tool called Prodigy, Canadian, created, based on the Ontario curriculum, but also linked to the American curriculum. And it collects data. So what can I know about the student? I can tell exactly what skills they are strong in, what skills they are weak in. I can tell when they went online, even if they were online at home. I can tell the amount of time they've spent on particular activities. And I can see specifically here which questions the students are getting right and which questions the students are getting wrong. And all of that information is sent to me in an email from Prodigy, and I have the opportunity to share it with the students or not. In one of the presentations earlier on, we saw data tracking. So running in the background, I have a tool called Ghostery. And as I open up the game of Prodigy, that my student that has been approved by the ministry in school, if I go to Ghostery, I can see the companies are actually collecting data on my students that I wasn't aware of until I started running this app. This is a tool created by the industry to help people learn what behavior analytics are all about. I can open up ad roll, and I can click here and find out exactly the kind of information they collect. So it's anonymous, right? But it collects demographic data on the students' page views, and pseudonymous, which has to do with the technical information about the tool. I'll just get my water. And because this is created by the industry to help consumers understand about the tool, I have the option of turning it off. So I can choose not to be tracked by that particular tool. Let's get back here, whoops.
This is Ghostery that's allowing you to create
This is Ghostery, created by the industry of behavior analytics to help to educate people about how data is collected, what actually is happening. You can run it in the background. I've also found that when I block certain things, my Adobe Connect doesn't run, right? So there's usefulness in this information that's being collected, and if you turn it all off, you won't have access to certain things. That's what I've discovered. And when I go on to the Huffington Post, for example, or something like that, I might see as many as 16 different companies collecting my behavior analytics as I move to that particular tool. That is very different from this tool, Knowledgeform, which is a project out of Boise by my name is Scardamillia and Carl Bereiter, all about knowledge building. Apple, Google, Microsoft have all offered to purchase it. They've said no thank you, because it collects very powerful analytics. But you can see, because it's not a commercial product, it looks like it was created in the 1980s. And yet, it's probably one of the most powerful learning tools I've ever come across. Because what it does, it allows students to construct knowledge and interact with each other, and it creates a map of all their conversations, and the map is completely dynamic. The students organize it itself. It also collects data, but students are in control of the data collection. So this is an inquiry that my students began working on this year, origin theories, and how did people come to North America. As they're constructing knowledge and contributing to the digital discussion, I would expect certain vocabulary to start appearing in their posts. So I'm not telling them what vocabulary to learn. That should start to appear as they build their knowledge out. And then I can do a word count, and I can see which students in which posts are using that particular data. If I was to go on Ghostery with this particular tool, it's zero. There is no, and that's such a relief to know as a teacher that no one is collecting analytics on my students as I use this particular tool. There you can see, this was a spontaneous conversation that I didn't even know had occurred in Knowledgeform. We had learned about Malala when she won the Nobel Prize, and we were in the computer lab at that point in time, and so they began investigating and construction of knowledge. And when I went to get a photo of Knowledgeform, I said, oh, there's a new dialogue box, what is that? And that is the conversation that had erupted between the students. And they actually have to build on each other's ideas. So if somebody contributes something here, somebody else will build on that particular idea, so the conversation expands out, expands out, and expands out. What's significant about this tool, it collects data. I can see vocabulary growth over time. I can also see thinking. So it analyzes the thinking of students, because they have to scaffold their thinking when they contribute and figure out what kind of contribution they are making to the learning. Are they adding an insight? Are they adding an image? How are they building the learning conversation? But what's powerful about this tool is students can access their own data, they can see their analysis, and they can figure out that, you know what, I'm only putting pictures in here, I need to start contributing more. So they're in charge of the data, and they're using the data to advance their own learning, which is very different from Prodigy, which collects data. Teacher gets the data, teacher tells the student about the data. Here they can monitor it themselves. So there's all that aspect of data collection. Of course, then there's that added layer, right, of the world that terrifies parents and teachers, and but is also amazing in terms of digital literacy. And there's consequences to things that happen in schools in a way that there wasn't before. So this particular news article is from the United States. The incident occurred about a week after the Boston bombing, where a high school student was doing a science experiment. There was a small explosion. The FBI were called in. She was arrested, and it's all over media as well, her name, everything to do with that. So there's consequences for what happens in our classrooms in a way that there wasn't previously. And probably the biggest one of all, these are New York students aware of the NSA, and they're asking their university to encrypt their data because they are targets of supervision because of their particular backgrounds, and they're in a university environment talking about controversial issues, which makes them a target for, what's going on there? So those are the kind of the big things that are out there now in education that weren't there previously. And yet, it's amazing. This is a project that's coming up, a global geography project, and using Esri mapping, so digital mapping tools, where students around the world are going to put data into a database on a map and then analyze the data as they find out about different students around the world. It's a really powerful piece of student creating the data and students interpreting the data, and it's data in real time about the communities that they're living in. And the internet's also about, just being funny. It's a fun space to be. So we've got that tension between all of those scary things and all of those fun and interesting things that we can do. So how do we create a middle space, right? Where we're not doing this to our students. If you go on the internet, you're going to be doomed, right? Or if you are protecting them so much that they're not aware of what the consequences are. And we have to help them navigate that particular tension. And just by saying to them, be careful, that's not enough, right? How do we help students become better thinkers, problem solvers, and decision makers in that really complex world that they are now inhabiting? I think the media literacy triangle is a really great place to start because it helps learners think about the kinds of questions they need to be asking about the media they are encountering. But I see this as a starting point only because they need to go to a much deeper level of thinking to really understand the kinds of questions that they're asking and the hidden information that they won't necessarily see the first time they think about a particular question. We also need to get them to question their conclusions that they're coming to as they answer those questions in the media literacy triangle. Search engine silos, so the more you search for something, the more the analytics collect on you, the more they send you information related to that particular topic, so you get stuck in a particular silo. And confirmation bias, which is we tend to look for things that confirm our understanding of the world and disregard things that don't confirm our understanding of the world. So that there's that layer of complexity in helping kids navigate the world of social media marketing and surveillance. So in my class, I teach thinking. That's the predominant subject that I teach. And I use language, social studies, computers as simply a tool to access good thinking. Part of what I do is done in conjunction with the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. They have a K-12 integrated thinking initiative. And this was developed by a graduate of Rotman's who said the kind of thinking and problem-solving strategies being taught in business school are being taught too late. We need to start this thinking at a younger age. And so they developed a K-12 initiative, really as an after-school program, and it's grown into something quite large. And now my board has a whole initiative that's developed out of the work I've done in my classroom, where we're training teachers in integrative thinking so they can teach these strategies to their students. So we begin by looking at the idea of mental models. And as students are interpreting the world, as we are interpreting the world, we're constantly constructing models in our head. We can't possibly take in all of the information that's around us. So we create a short form, and we build that idea in our head, but it's only ever a partial piece of information. So when I say to you, city, some of you might see this. Some of you might see this, which is the city of Hamilton, believe it or not, those of you who have never been there. I've just challenged your mental model. And some of you might see this. So if your starting points for interpreting information are such different places, children need to understand the different places that thinkers are coming from, and they also need to understand why they have that idea in the first place. So getting them to understand mental models is a really good starting point. When we construct our models, we often don't see past our first impressions. So some of you see the duck, but some of you see the rabbit. And I always gravitate to the duck, and I have a hard time seeing the rabbit, right? So once we've got our first impressions, we don't tend to go past those. We make up things in our head, and we see things that aren't really there. And often we don't even know why we form those conclusions. So this was an experiment in the United States where university students were asked to come and test headphones while they were listening to an editorial. And half the group was asked to nod their head, and half the group was asked to shake their head this way. And then they were asked, they asked lots of questions about the quality of the headphones, and just one minor question at the end, which was, by the way, did you agree or disagree with the editorial you listened to? By and large, those who were asked to nod their head agreed, and those who were asked to shake their head disagreed with the editorial. That's hugely significant, because we're often not realizing why we're coming to the conclusions that we are coming to. Things are often framed for us. So this is just a random dot picture, but now it's pretty hard not to see the Dalmatian because I framed it for you. Okay? So if I was to ask you what a doctor looks like, you're not likely to see this. You're more likely to see the guy on the left-hand side in your head. So there's an incredible amount of freedom for students in recognizing that you're only ever working with your current model of understanding, and there's something else to be added to that piece of information, because suddenly everyone's wrong. And that's a liberating moment for kids in the classroom. So one of the ways I get students to examine the information is something called the ladder of inference. So there is a huge data pool of information available to us in any situation. We select data from that data pool, and we're not even necessarily aware of why we're selecting that data. We interpret that data, we come to conclusions, we act, and that causes us then to pay attention to the data pool that's coming at us next, maybe in a very different way. So for example, if a student's walking down the hallway and their friend goes past them, and the student walking down says hi and the friend doesn't say hi, that person might come to the conclusion, based on the information they saw, that oh, my friend's mad at me. What did I do? And start running those thoughts through their heads, coming to conclusions. The friend who didn't say hello may have had a fight with their parent in the morning. That information in the data pool is not available to the other student, so they're jumping up their ladders in very different ways. This is probably the most significant tool I use with my students in the classroom, because as we have our conversations, we talk about what information did you pay attention to, why did you reach this conclusion and not this conclusion. And after a while, kids start to accuse each other of being up on their ladders, and me of being up on my ladder. And it's a very useful tool in interpreting the actions of your spouses, by the way. And to most of all, back down your ladder and see what information is that you missed. So in this particular case, they had read a story, and a character had died in the story. And so we constructed the ladders of different characters and could see why they came to very different conclusions based on the information each had paid attention to in the data pool. So this was an article that we looked at last year. It was a gun shooting in the United States. And essentially this boy here, Jordan Davis, was in a car with a bunch of friends. And this man here ended up shooting him, killing him. And this is the article about it. So my students looked at all the information in the data pool, saw what the murderer, Michael Dunn, was paying attention to, saw what Jordan Davis may have been paid attention to. So it helps them understand reasons why people are thinking and acting the way they are thinking, and what would happen if they paid attention to information in a different way. And that was just a written explanation of one of my students did of the ladder of inference. All these slides, by the way, are on my blog, and almost all the slides, some I've taken off. So you have a chance to look at those in greater detail afterwards. So an example of how we use the ladder of inference in my classroom. This was for my grade 6 class last year, and some people then mentioned that the humpback whale had been removed from the endangered species list in Canada. Previously, when I would have conducted a discussion about that, well, how do you feel about that? What do you think about that? Then we would have talked about it in this way. The very first thing we did with this was monitor our ladders. Who's just jumped to a conclusion? What conclusion have you reached in your head? So they understand their starting point for interpreting information. And for some kids, their conclusion, immediate reaction, this is terrible, Canada's not protecting whales. For other kids, the conclusion was, wow, this is great, must mean the whales are saved. So each one is coming at this in a very different way, and the latter helps us understand what information they've paid attention to reach that particular conclusion. And we discussed something in the knowledge building circle, and this is my other favorite way of discussing information in the classroom. It's very democratic. When we do our inquiry, when we bring information together, we sit in a circle and we share and discuss our ideas. And kids learn the language of discussion because they have to build on each other's ideas. So you start to hear things like, I'd like to build on so-and-so's idea. And they wait patiently to contribute their own information. Everybody's incredibly accountable in this format because showing up at the knowledge building circle with nothing to contribute, even if it's just a question, is uncomfortable for students. So they learn to articulate, and they learn to express themselves, and they learn to listen to each other. After we had the knowledge building circle on the humpback whale story, we had a little writing piece about it, right? So this was a student who talked about their initial reaction. At first I thought this is not good because it's no longer on the threatened list. Why he paid attention to that particular, why he reached that conclusion, so what was in his data pool, and why he climbed back down his ladder and realized I need to go find more information so I can form a better conclusion. Another thing that we look at is System 1 and System 2 thinking, and I got caught by this picture myself. So we learn to describe our thinking in the classroom as System 1 or System 2. So System 1 thinking is your quick response, when you immediately go up the ladder of inference, and System 2 thinking is much slower. And you actually have a physiological reaction to that. Heartbeat increases, you use more energy, your pupils will dilate when you have to think more deeply. And this is actually what the house looks like. That is a media construction in this previous picture. There is no camera there at George Orwell's house. It's just somebody having a bit of a laugh on the internet, right? But with my System 2 thinking, when I say ask kids that, because they have a vocabulary to describe that thinking, did you use your System 1 or System 2, they recognize, wait, I need to slow down, I need to think more, I need to look a little deeper into what it is that I'm looking at. Another tool that I've learned to use from I Think at Rotman's is causal modeling. And if you think of the kinds of problems that we present to students in schools, most of them are simple. This particular one. We might have a complicated problem, right? How do I get to the airport from here? There's not endless solutions. There might be many, but there's only a limited number of ways to get there. And then there's wicked problems. Problems that are not easy to discuss or solve or for students to envision in their heads. There's so much embedded in this particular problem. How do you even begin figuring out what it is that you need to solve here? And these are the kinds of problems kids encounter when they're viewing media on the internet, and these are the kinds of problems we need to be giving students to think about. So we learn to break down ideas using something called causal modeling. And it looks like a web, but it's not. In a web, you're just listing information. Here we're looking for causality and their understanding of causality, so their starting point for thinking in the idea. So this is one that my grade 7 students did. What causes homework not to get done? They broke down the issue. Well, you forget. Well, what causes you to forget? Well, maybe you're a procrastinator. Maybe you have too much on your mind. Maybe you're not taking enough interest in trying to remember. So by doing causal modeling, it allows them to start breaking down the complexity of ideas. This was also a causal model that two girls did of the homework question. And as they started going deeper and deeper into the causality, they recognized that homework not getting done, in some cases, is related to the idea of poverty. And that if you could start addressing this part of the problem of poverty, you could begin finding a solution to homework not getting done. This learning how to causal model is such a high-level thinking skill. It really helps students make their thinking visible. It helps them uncover what's hidden in their minds. They haven't even gone to do any research yet, but they can frame the complexity of the idea that they're holding in their head and begin to break it down. This was another causal model that we did of a short story, and I put the link there, All Summer in a Day by Ray Bradbury. It's on Venus. Now we have the internet, so we know it doesn't rain on Venus all day. But when it was written, it rains every day for 10 years, and one day every 10 years the sun comes out, and there's a colony of children living there underground, and one day every 10 years people get to go out in the sun, and then there's a girl who's come to planet Venus who has come from Earth. And on the day that the sun is about to come out, the teacher leaves the room for a minute, and the kids end up playing a joke on the girl Margot, lock her in the closet, and the teacher comes back in, and the excitement, they forget she's there, and they go out for the day of the sun, and the story ends with them coming back in and realizing, after that incredible experience, they've left her in the closet. So the question was, who was responsible for Margot being locked in the closet? And when I initially did this with a writing paragraph format, well, the kids were bullies. And that was the extent of the student thinking. When they began to break it down this way, we started asking, well, what would cause those children to be bullies? And as they tore the idea apart, they began to see the role of the scientists. They began to see the role of the parents. They began to see the role of economics. They began to see so much more that's embedded in a small, not a small problem, a big problem like bullying. They can start to express the complexity of a concept like that. This is a little aside. As we build knowledge in my classroom, we constantly have a paper map in front of us. So I don't teach mapping the way I used to previously, and as kids go to the internet, they learn, they go back to their map, and they plot immediately where that story has taken place, so they begin to construct a visual of what the world looks like. And that map was related to this particular activity. Going back to the whale question, we had a discussion, well, what do you actually know about the world? And actually, kids don't know a lot. There wasn't a lot they could actually tell, so we think they're sophisticated. They're encountering a lot of information, but what they actually know and understand, it's still an 8, 9, 10-year-old brain that you're dealing with. So the idea of the United Nations came up, and well, what is that? Well, I think they help people, and I think there's many countries involved, and they didn't really know. So then we came up with a theory, well, where do you think it would be if it's an organization that's many countries and help people? And those were their two theories that they came up with, really logical for a 10-year-old brain, that, well, nobody owns Antarctica, so that could be equally shared, or maybe an island in the middle of the ocean. When we encounter, though, or begin developing theories, we go search for answers to our questions. So we go onto the internet, we go into books, and we try to either confirm or disconfirm. And teaching students to disconfirm what their thinking is an essential skill for them to have. And we don't often teach them how to do that. Eventually they discovered that the United Nations is, of course, in New York City. And this is the new knowledge that they now have that they would bring to the knowledge building circle to share with the class. In that process, they discovered that Stephen Harper was not enamored of the United Nations, and there was a trigger for inquiry. Is that a reasonable stance? Yes?
Could you explain how disconfirming occurs?
Usually it occurs, in this particular case, they were on the internet and they were using Google Maps to try and find the United Nations. And so once they had located on the map, oh, I've disconfirmed my theory, it's actually in. So it goes through their exploration of their idea, looking for information on that. And then we teach the search skills and all of those the skills in getting to the information I teach in relation to their theories and their questions. Does that help? Okay. So this is still a favorite thing, my map. This map is so outdated, but they love going to this. This is an example of them going to the internet to build their understanding of the UN. Again, our knowledge building circle. We were very fortunate to have, while that inquiry was going on, Phil Fry come in, who is running schools in Kenya. And so he came in and participated in our knowledge building circle because he had experience of the United Nations, because he was running a company there, a for-profit company that's really interesting. So he could give his perspective on the United Nations and whether Stephen Harper's stance is reasonable based on how he saw the United Nations operating, or whether Stephen Harper's stance was not reasonable based on how he saw the United Nations operating. So it was real-world information for them to consider. Another activity that we do to help students be more open to ideas, this is another enormous leap forward for students in thinking is to go look for the value in really bad ideas. So this idea here was, what if we turned the gym into a chicken coop? And we had to start looking for where value would lie in that particular thing. Well, you could play games, and you could do science and biology, and you could learn how to cook, and you'd have defense mechanisms, because if the school was egged, you could fire back. And it was a really fun activity for the kids. And then what we did was try and find themes or commonalities in the ideas that they came up with. And we came to, as we grouped all of those ideas, we came to realize, well, part of those ideas were all about really having more fun and entertainment at school. Part of it was about learning how business operates, and part of it was about just survival, getting food, those kinds of things. So once we identified what the benefits of those things were, then we looked at, well, how can you get that same benefit without actually having to turn the gym into a chicken coop? So then they become knowledge creators, and they can generate ideas to address that, or solution finders. We also learned in my class that entrenched positions are not particularly useful. And they encounter lots of that on the internet these days. All you have to do is think of Fox News, and you will see entrenched positions. And either or choices are also really, really limiting. So in my classroom, we have learned to think about information in a very different way. We use something called the pro-pro model. And when we, in the past, where we would have debated whether or not Snowden was a traitor or a hero, I don't often do debates with my students anymore. It's fun to do, but it's not particularly valuable, because there's a losing side, there's a winning side, there's lots. It places people into a position of conflict rather than a position of finding a solution. And in this complex world they're inhabiting these days, we need to train them to be solution finders. So that I almost consider debating an old skill, and learning how to contend with complex information so that you can create solutions is the new skill we need to be teaching them. And so what we do in the pro-pro model is we go to extremes in creating the models, because that way nobody's emotionally attached to an extreme idea. So what would a world of total surveillance actually look like? And then we just describe it. We don't attach judgment to it, we just describe what it looks like. What would a world of zero surveillance just actually look like? We try to conceptualize that and actually describe that model. And then we pick some stakeholders, government, citizen, and business, and try to figure out for them what's valuable about that particular model. For this side, what's valuable about that particular model, because stakeholders have interests and sides have interests. And then we try to distill it down to an essential idea. Well, a world of total surveillance is really all maybe about safety. They could come up with a different idea, they have to name it. Or a world of zero surveillance is really all about freedom. And then we move into design thinking. How do we design a system that allows privacy to be protected, that's safe, that fosters positive social relationships, that enables the advancement of knowledge, and we start looking for solutions and trying to design things with that solution in mind. So the pro-pro model takes the students out of conflict and into finding a solution. Again, it's a very liberating thing, because it gives them control and allows them to use their imagination, and they become agents of change rather than victims of ideas. This one I struggle with. Has anybody seen Animal Jam? It's created by National Geographic. It's won many, many awards. And what, I don't know how far along in my time here. I'm not going to look. You're stuck here. Oh, wait a second. No, the sound's not working. It's not picking up from the VGA cable. I will describe it then to you. Sorry about that. So this is a mediated space. And it's all about safety. And it's an interactive social game that kids can go into play that's all about animals. So they get an avatar, they have characters, and people can come to that space and they can interact socially with each other within that space. And it's very, very creative. It also has surveillance features built into the game. So there are moderators who sit in the background, and when kids try and cross a line, for example, using an inappropriate word, there's actually a data bank of words that are inappropriate, and that usually gets flagged and gets a warning, or the parents receive an email that that student is engaging in inappropriate language in there. So there's all kinds of things built into this particular game that are designed to begin teaching the principles of behaving well in a social community, but then there's also a whole level of compliance and being supervised, and those issues about how children play differently when they are being observed that are embedded within this game that aren't discussed. And I really recommend going to watch that particular video, but the sound's not coming up. It was my kids at school who showed this particular tool to me, 2 girls in the class, and one girl was so articulate in explaining why she likes this tool. And for her, going into online media with all that she's heard and the risks out there, this is a safe space where she knows if people are going to start behaving badly, that someone's looking out for them, for their interests, and somebody like a predator would not be allowed to function within this game because there's a level of supervision within it. So she likes this because she can interact socially and with her avatar, and she doesn't have to worry about it being unsafe. Yet, because of that, the children, as an educator, I see would be behaving differently than how they would in a game like Minecraft that is completely creative, that has no supervision, and allows endless possibilities for the children, not necessarily children, but participants, to act in that space. So, is this a constructive way of having learners participate in social media games? Is it a limiting way? I really don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's interesting, and it's an interesting question and discussion for us to have, because I find it highly supervised and unfree, yet my learners love that. And then I began to think about, have they become normalized to surveillance? And is that really what's happening there? And if they're becoming normalized to surveillance, what does that mean for our future? And that's a really unsettling question for me, and I'm not sure what it means, but it definitely needs to be part of this discussion.
That's a fantastic media studies opportunity.
No kidding. Absolutely.
And perhaps the students have an open discussion about it.
Yeah, well, we're going to go there because she really wants to show it to the class, and we will probably go there and have a look at that and think about that, and think we're going to have a lot of Minecrafters as well. And just, yeah, that's
well, your ladder of inference is going to come into play.
Absolutely, and the causal modeling, right? So the causal modeling question would be, what causes us to have surveillance?
Thinking of surveillance, Heidi, remember how most kids talk their parents into their first cell phone? You'll always know where I am. You'll always be able to reach me. You're inviting them to have surveillance. Of course, kids have a million ways of dodging them. That's always the argument.
Absolutely, right? And then they ignore you when you text them.
I got you, Mr.
And this has won all kinds of awards. Parents love it, and like the kids like it. And it was fun when I went on. It was a great place to be, and it was kind of reassuring that okay, they can go there. They're little. They're not going to encounter a predator there. That's a reassuring piece. But there definitely are some bigger questions that need to be asked, and maybe this is a stage in social media use by children, right? This might be where they begin, but then they need to move to something else, and they definitely need to have that discussion about surveillance and what it means to be surveilled. This is my husband, who teaches at Humber College, who showed me the ghostery tool, also started showing me some other things. Now, as we move forward in behavioral analytics, right? So the analytics that collect information of how we behave on the internet. This is another place where the advertising industry is trying to educate consumers of how analytics are used. It is full of really useful information, including, if you go into it with the participants in the companies, of particular companies, how they collect data, what they do with the data. So again, it's something, as children are working in these spaces, is a really good learning opportunity to help them understand both the benefits, because there are benefits to behavior analytics, and some of the risks involved in that.